The day is slowly drawing to a close on the Eastern Front. The sky, once grey and heavy, begins to darken as if a curtain were being drawn over the world. The light gradually disappears, and with it goes the only thing that still gave the men in the German trenches some sense of control: visibility. The cold doesn't just bother you, it invades you. It slips into his wet boots, up his legs, stiffens his fingers, which can barely hold the rifle anymore. The wind cuts his face like tiny, invisible blades, opening cracks in his skin. Breathing hurts. Standing still hurts even more. But none of that is the worst part. The worst thing is the silence. During the day, there were gunshots, artillery, shouts, the constant chaos that, in a way, kept the men alert, occupied, alive. Now, nothing. Only the sound of the wind whistling through barbed wire, producing a low, almost human moan. Inside the trenches, the soldiers hardly speak. Some pretend to clean their weapons. Others stare into the void, their eyes deep and tired. There are those who try to smoke, but even the faint glow of a cigarette seems too dangerous. A light can mean death. They already know what's coming. No one needs to say anything. It's not the first night. And that's exactly what makes it all the worse. A younger soldier swallows hard, trying to hide the trembling in his hands. Beside him, a veteran simply stares motionless at the dark horizon, like someone who has already accepted the inevitable. There is no heroism. In that moment, only waiting, a suffocating wait, because when darkness finally takes over everything, the war changes. It ceases to be a battle of positions and transforms into something much more primitive, more intimate, more cruel. The Germans know they are no longer fighting a distant enemy. At night, the enemy draws near, checkpoints, observe, wait. And the most terrifying thing of all is that you almost never see where it comes from. A distant snap. The noise was too faint to be sure. Everyone freezes, nobody talks, their eyes widen, fingers tighten on the triggers, but nobody shoots. Not yet. Because shooting in the dark can give away your position, and on that night, being seen first is the same as dying first. Silence returns, heavier than before, more alive, more threatening, and in that icy emptiness, every man there understands deep in his soul. The day was all about survival, but the night is pure terror. The reputation of Soviet night raids. Even before nightfall, fear already circulates through the German trenches like an invisible disease. It doesn't stem from what the soldiers are seeing at that moment, but from what they've already heard. Stories, whispered tales, repeated in low voices, almost as if speaking aloud could attract what everyone fears. These are not exaggerated propaganda stories. They are real experiences brought by men who survived, or rather escaped, from previous nights. And these stories follow a pattern. Soviet night. Attacks do not follow the rules of traditional warfare. There is no warning. There is no initial massive bombardment to prepare the ground. There is no large-scale advance that can be identified from a distance. They come in silence. The Germans are beginning to understand that they are not dealing with just soldiers, but with something much closer to hunters. Small Soviet groups infiltrate the darkness like experienced predators. They know the terrain, study the enemy's habits, observe the sentries' schedules, and memorize every detail of the trenches. They don't attack on impulse. They choose the moment. And when that moment arrives, it's already too late to react. There are reports of sentries found dead without having fired a single shot. Throats cut, bodies still warm, lying in absolute silence, as if life had been ripped away in the blink of an eye. Others tell of shadows that emerge from within the trenches themselves, as if born from the darkness. 1 second, there is no one there. The next, an enemy is just a few meters away, and then comes the chaos. Grenades thrown into tight spaces where there's nowhere to run. Explosions muffled by the earth, but violent enough to tear bodies apart and scatter fragments everywhere. Short screams, abruptly cut off, the dry sound of bayonets meeting flesh. And what's most disturbing is how fast it is happening. These attacks don't last for hours. Sometimes they don't even last minutes. By the time the Germans finally manage to organize themselves, light flares, or fire into the darkness, the Soviets have already vanished, like ghosts, taking with them information, prisoners, or simply leaving behind enough destruction to ensure that that night will never be forgotten. This reputation grows with each passing night. It spreads among the units, traversing entire sectors of the battlefront. Newly arrived soldiers listen to the veterans and try not to show fear, but they fail, because it's not a common fear. It's not the fear of facing a visible enemy in an open field with some chance of reaction. It's the fear of the unknown, from the invisible, from the moment the silence is broken, not by a warning, but by the direct start of violence. Some soldiers are beginning to believe that the Soviets can see in the dark. Others say they move like animals, crawling for hours without making the slightest sound. There are even those who swear that they observe for days before attacking, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. Whatever the truth may be, it doesn't matter much, because the psychological effect is the same. As night approaches, the heart beats faster, the body tenses, fatigue accumulates, but sleep doesn't come. Nobody wants to close their eyes, because everyone knows that when the attacks begin, there's no time to wake up. Soviet preparation in the dark. On the other side of the front line, while fear silently grows among the Germans, there is movement. But it's not a chaotic movement. It is necessary, controlled, trained. In near total darkness, Soviet soldiers organize themselves with a cold, almost mechanical discipline. There are no unnecessary conversations, no laughter, no room for visible nervousness. Each man knows exactly what he needs to do and what is at stake. There, the night is not the enemy. She is an ally. Their faces are smeared with dirt and soot, not just from the war, but as part of the strategy. Any reflection of light can give away a position. Any glimmer can mean death before the attack even begins. The uniforms are carefully adjusted. Equipment is checked one last time in absolute silence. Nothing can make a sound. Nothing can go wrong. The weapons chosen for that mission say a lot about the type of combat that is to come. Knives, bayonets, grenades strapped to the body. Some carry submachine guns, but they know they should only use them when silence is no longer an option. The goal is not just to kill, it's to get close without being detected. No shots fired, without warning. An officer moves among the men, speaking softly, almost whispering. There are no grand speeches, just short, direct instructions, repeated clearly. Move forward, eliminate, retreat. Simple. Airplane. The soldiers listen and nod. Many of them have done this before. Others are about to face their first night raid. For younger people, fear exists. But it is different from the German fear. It's not the fear of the unknown. It's controlled, channeled fear, transformed into focus, into determination, into something that propels the body forward, even when the mind hesitates. One of the men grips the handle of his knife tightly. Another adjusts the grenade strapped to his chest. A third closes his eyes for a brief second, as if memorizing each step he needs to take. They know they cannot hesitate. In the darkness, hesitation means noise, and noise means death. The signal has been given, not with a shout, not with a gunshot, but with an almost imperceptible gesture. And then they start to move, slowly at first, then at a steady pace. Low bodies, almost glued to the frozen ground, hands and knees sinking into the hardened mud. Every movement calculated to avoid making a sound. Even breathing is controlled. They don't march like an army. They advance like shadows. They pass through craters opened by old explosions, dodge barbed wire, and use every irregularity in the terrain as cover. The hostile environment, which for many would be an obstacle, for them is a perfect ally. The darkness hides them, silence protects them, and patience brings them closer. Every meter gained reduces the distance between them and the German trenches. Every passing second increases the tension. Up ahead, the Germans are still waiting, staring at nothing. Without knowing that, at that exact moment, the danger is already creeping towards them. Night now dominates everything. There is no longer a horizon, no longer any point of reference. The world seems reduced to shadows and distorted shapes. The sky is a dark, heavy block, without enough stars to guide any direction. It's as if nature itself had decided to extinguish any trace of light. And in this scenario, the weather is not just a detail, it's a silent enemy. The cold intensifies with each passing minute. It's not just discomfort, it's constant pain. It stiffens muscles, slows reflexes, and numbs fingers. Holding a gun is no longer easy. Feeling the trigger, sometimes it's impossible. The air enters the lungs like ice. Taking a deep breath causes a sharp, almost cutting sensation. Some German soldiers try to warm their hands inside their coats, but soon give up. Taking their hands off their weapons, even for a few seconds, can cost them their lives. The mud, in turn, transforms the terrain into a living trap. During the day, it was already treacherous. Now, with the drop in temperature, parts of it begin to harden, while others remain damp and sticky. One wrong step can produce a dry sound, or worse, trap the boot tightly enough to slow a reaction. And at night, any delay is fatal. The wind blows steadily, carrying with it a strange, irregular sound. It passes through barbed wire, craters, trenches, creating noises that confuse the senses. Sometimes it sounds like a whisper, other times a movement. The German soldiers try to listen carefully, but they can't distinguish what is wind and what isn't. That's the real danger, because darkness doesn't just hide the enemy, she distorts reality. A branch breaking can sound like a footstep. The wind can seem like breathing. A shadow can move, even when no one is there. Or worse, it may seem like nothing when someone really is. For the Soviets, this environment is not an obstacle. That's an advantage. They've already figured out how to use each element to their advantage. The cold hardens the enemy. The mud slows them down. The wind masks their movements. And the darkness transforms them into something almost invisible. Meanwhile, in the German trenches, physical discomfort begins to mix with something deeper, anxiety. The men move very little, trying to conserve energy and avoid noise, but this only makes the situation worse. The more immobile they remain, the more the cold overwhelms their bodies, the more their muscles stiffen. The harder it becomes to react quickly. A soldier tries to flex his fingers, but they barely respond. Another adjusts his helmet, looking ahead without really seeing anything. Time seems to drag on. Each minute feels like an eternity. And in this hostile scenario, where the environment itself seems to conspire against those trying to survive, the line between being alert and vulnerable is beginning to disappear. Because no matter how prepared a man is, when the body fails, the mind begins to fail as well. And that's exactly what transforms that night into something far more dangerous than a simple battle. There, the cold paralyzes. He takes the blade. Darkness deceives. And amidst all of this, the enemy approaches unseen. For long minutes, perhaps hours, nothing happens. Or at least, nothing that can be proven. In the German trenches, the men remain motionless, eyes fixed on the darkness, ears alert to any change in the environment. The silence, heavy as lead, seems to crush their thoughts. Each soldier struggles against his own mind, trying not to imagine things, trying not to turn fear into something real. But then, something changes. It's small, almost insignificant. A short, dry sound, like a slight crackling sound coming from somewhere ahead. A branch? Is the ice breaking or a miscalculated move? The sentry frowns. His whole body stiffens. He holds his breath unconsciously, trying to hear better. His heart, previously racing, now seems to beat harder, heavier, as if each pulse echoes inside his own helmet. He looks to the side. Another soldier heard it too. They say nothing. They don't need to. Their eyes meet for a brief second, and there is a silent understanding. That wasn't the wind, but there's not enough certainty either, and this doubt is cruel, because reacting too soon can be a fatal mistake. A shot in the dark can reveal the entire position of the trench. It can attract enemy fire. It can turn a suspicion into a real attack, but not reacting. It could be even worse. The soldier slowly adjusts his rifle, pointing it in the direction he believes the sound came from. His fingers, stiffened by the cold, grip the wood of the weapon tightly. He tries to control his breathing, but the air comes out ragged, forming small clouds visible in the icy darkness. Silence again, heavy. Time seems to freeze. Then another sound, closer. This time it's not a snap. It's something that drags on, very light, almost imperceptible, like fabric scraping against the earth, or a body moving slowly across frozen ground. Now there is no doubt. Something is out there. Something is approaching. Fear spreads quickly, but remains contained. One of the soldiers makes a discreet gesture, alerting the others in the trench. Minimal movements, nothing abrupt, nothing that produces unnecessary sound. Some men raise their heads slightly, trying to see beyond the darkness. Others grip their weapons more tightly. One of them swallows hard, the sound too loud for his liking. But still, they see nothing. And that's what makes it all worse, because the enemy at that moment could be just a few meters away, observing, waiting, choosing the exact moment. The soldier on the front line feels something strange, an instinct, that primal sensation of being watched, even without concrete proof. His whole body reacts before his mind can explain it. He pulls the trigger, but hesitates 1 second, just a second, and in the night war, a single second can be the difference between life and death. Then, without warning, a third sound breaks the silence. Much closer, too close. And at that moment, everyone in the trench understands the same thing. At the same time, the enemy is no longer coming. He has already arrived. When the Germans finally realize they are no longer alone in that darkness, it is already too late to react clearly. Outside the trench, practically invisible, the Soviet soldiers were already inside the defensive perimeter. There was no running, no shouting, no typical battle advance that can be heard from a distance. What there was patience. Minutes, sometimes hours, of slow, calculated, almost imperceptible approach. They crawled for meters and meters of frozen ground, feeling the cold penetrate their bones, ignoring the discomfort, ignoring the pain. Every movement was measured, every advance tested before being completed. Hands touching the ground before putting weight on it, knees advancing millimeter by millimeter, entire bodies sliding through the hardened mud. No unnecessary noise, no errors. Ahead of them, the first obstacle, the barbed wire. During the day, he would be a visible, protected, observed barrier. But in the darkness, he becomes just another detail to be overcome. One of the Soviet soldiers approaches slowly, removing a small tool. His movements are so careful that the very air seems to hold its breath around him. The metal is cut with precision, no crackling sounds, no vibration. The opening is small, almost imperceptible, but sufficient. One by one, they pass through, sliding through the gaps as if they were part of the terrain itself. Next comes the most critical moment. The sentinels. The Germans are positioned to observe and warn, the first line between safety and disaster. They are alert, but they are battling the cold, the fatigue, and their own minds, which are beginning to doubt every sound. And it is precisely at this point that the Soviets attack, not with gunshots, but with closeness. One of the Soviet soldiers emerges from behind a German sentry like a shadow taking shape. There is no warning. There is no time to react. One arm wraps around the neck, pulling the body back while the other hand executes the blow with a knife. Fast, necessary, silent. The body loses strength almost immediately. There is no scream, only a muffled sound swallowed by the night. The soldier is slowly placed on the ground, as if he were still alive, as if he were still on guard. A few meters away, another sentry disappears in the same way, and then another. Within minutes, key observation points cease to exist, and nobody inside. The trench notices. The Soviets continue to advance. Now already inside the German lines, they move even more slowly. Every step is a risk. Every shadow could hide an awakened enemy. They stop, observe, listen. They sense their surroundings. They know they are surrounded by armed men, but they also know that these men still don't understand what's happening. And that's the advantage. Darkness covers everything. Movements blend into the environment. The wind continues to blow, masking any residual noise. The mud absorbs the footsteps. It's as if the battlefield itself is aiding in the infiltration. Inside the trenches, some Germans begin to sense that something is wrong. They can't explain it. Perhaps it's the unusual silence. Perhaps it's the absence of a comrade who should be there. But before they can react, there are already enemies among them, just a few meters away, breathing the same air, waiting for the exact moment to transform that silence into violence. And when that moment arrives, there will be no front line, there will be no distance. The war will no longer be between two sides, and it will become something much closer, much more brutal. The moment of waiting, that fragile veil of quietude that the Germans had woven with threads of exhaustion and the illusion of security, is suddenly torn apart, without warning, without fanfare, without the slightest hint of mercy. There is no war trumpet echoing across the icy vastness of the Russian steppe, nor a primal cry uniting the ranks in collective fury. What erupts is something worse, a silence that shatters like shards of glass, an abrupt, blind and disorienting violence that emerges from the very bowels of the night, as if the abyss had decided to devour the living. Inside the trench, a German soldier, a young man from Berlin, his face still marked by his mother's last letter that would never arrive, is still trying to comprehend the inexplicable disappearance of the outpost's sentry. His eyes, accustomed to the oppressive darkness of the Eastern Front, scan the cold fog when, suddenly, something falls with a dull thud a few meters away. A grenade, round, malevolent like an iron egg incubated by Soviet hatred. For a brief, eternal second, no one reacts. The human mind, that fragile machine of reason, takes time to process the unthinkable. The heart races, the stomach clenches, and the whole world seems to hold its breath. And then, the explosion tears through the darkness like primordial thunder. The earth trembles with ancient fury. The damp earthen walls of the trench vibrate as if Mother Russia herself were revolting against the invaders. The sound is muffled by the narrow walls, but the force is devastating, an invisible punch that hurls bodies against the frozen mud. Fragments of hot metal cut through the air like invisible blades, piercing flesh, tearing grey uniforms, spreading a gush of warm blood that instantly mixes with the dirty snow and churned earth. Screams erupt, not the ordered cries of a battlefield, but guttural primal howls of excruciating pain and deadly surprise. One man loses half his face, another feels his arm ripped from his shoulder, and the shock keeps him standing for endless seconds before horror overwhelms him. Silence dies there, drowned in blood and smoke, and in its place, absolute chaos is born, a vortex of panic that swallows everything. Other grenades appear almost immediately, launched from impossible angles, from points the Germans swore were being watched. Some roll across the uneven trench floor, striking boots before detonating with a bang that makes eardrums bleed. Others explode in the air, scattering shrapnel in deadly fans that sweep across the piled-up bodies. There is no time to take adequate cover. There is not enough space to escape. The trench, designed as a fortress, now becomes a mass grave, a narrow labyrinth where every turn is a trap. Soldiers, jolted from sleep or exhausted vigil, stumble over each other, slipping in the mud that turns into a viscous sludge of blood, urine, and feces released by pure terror. The Germans awoke in visceral panic. Some had been dozing, too exhausted after days of relentless bombing, dreaming of warm bread from home or the face of a forgotten bride. Others were merely trying to preserve the last crumbs of energy, smoking damp cigarettes or murmuring prayers in hushed voices. Now, they were all brutally ripped from this false sense of security, as if God himself had turned his back. No one understood exactly what was happening. Where did the attack come from? How many enemies? How did they enter, these demons of the night that seemed to sprout from the earth like poisonous roots? The questions surged like blades in the brain, but there was no time for answers, only for the animal instinct to survive one more second. A soldier tries to stand but slips on the mud, mixed with the warm blood of a comrade who agonizes beside him. His eyes glazed with disbelief. Another shouts for orders, "Feuer! Feuer!" But his voice is swallowed by a new explosion that makes the air vibrate, as if the whole world were split in two. A third fires his Mauser in the dark, without a defined target, just to hear the comforting crack, trying to hit any moving shadow. The shots begin chaotically, confused, dangerous, because in the impenetrable darkness, any silhouette could be the enemy, or a brother in arms. And that is precisely what makes the attack even more effective, more diabolical. The Soviets no longer need silence. They are already inside, infiltrated like ghosts, trained in the Red Army's sapper schools, knowing every inch of that terrain that the Germans considered theirs. Between the acrid cordite smoke and the blinding flashes of explosions, swift silhouettes emerge, almost impossible to follow. They move with the speed of nocturnal predators, knowing the terrain as if the trench were an extension of their own bodies. A German turns a corner and finds himself facing an enemy less than 2 meters away, a bearded face, wild eyes beneath a Soviet steel helmet. There is no time to aim, no time to think. The fight explodes right there, immediate, brutal, animalistic. A rifle butt crushes a nose with a wet crack. A Soviet blade pierces a heavy coat, tearing muscle and rib. A pistol shot explodes in such a confined space that the sound is like a hammer against the skull. The screams grow louder in a hellish chorus. They are not organized shouts of command. They are howls of excruciating pain, of deadly surprise, of pure, abject terror that freezes the soul. The trench, once a symbol of Teutonic protection, transforms into a deadly trap, a cramped space where the attack spreads like poison in the blood, without a clear line of defense, without a safe rear. The enemy emerges from any direction, from above, from below, from the shadows between the sandbags. The lighting is minimal, a luxury stolen by the Russian night. Some soldiers in desperation launch flares that rise in trembling arcs, creating short flashes of white light that reveal nightmarish scenes. Contorted bodies on the ground, men locked in hand-to-hand combat, faces distorted by hatred and fear, black blood glistening in the fleeting light. And then the light disappears again, swallowed by absolute darkness, returning to the uncertainty that multiplies the panic. The German command tries to react, but communication fails like a stopped heart. Shouted orders are lost in the roar of explosions. Messages run through severed telephone lines. Messengers fall before they arrive. Each group of soldiers begins to act on its own, a handful here, another there, and this only amplifies the disorganization, transforming the defense into isolated fragments of despair. Meanwhile, the Soviets press with surgical precision, not in a blind mass like the human waves of the early stages of the war, but like sharp blades, attacking specific points, the command nodes, the ammunition depots, the machine gun positions, causing maximum destruction in the shortest possible time, with the efficiency born of years of fighting against the fascist invader. And then, With the same sudden and cruel force with which it began, the attack reaches its peak of fury. The trench is no longer a defensive position. It is a scene of total destruction, of maddening confusion, of absolute fear that paralyzes the soul. Bodies pile up in the bends. The air reeks of burnt gunpowder, burnt flesh, and the metallic odor of blood. And in the midst of all this, a truth becomes clear to all the Germans who can still think amidst the delirium. They are not fighting against a common attack, against a visible enemy that can be faced with Prussian discipline. They are fighting against something that is already inside the lines, inside the mind, inside the darkness itself, something that knows chaos better than they ever will. Something that transforms the Russian night into an eternal ally and the trench into a collective grave. Despair settles like a cold fog in the chest. The feeling that the Reich, once invincible, now bleeds in a mud pit, forgotten by Berlin, betrayed by the infinite vastness of the East. When the smoke from the explosions begins to dissipate, a dense, suffocating fog, carrying the smell of death and burnt cordite, what remains inside the trench is no longer military organization, nor the rigidity of German doctrine. It is pure, raw survival, reduced to the bone, man against man, instinct against instinct, life against the abyss that opens beneath their feet. The distance between combatants has evaporated like dew in the sun. There are no longer well-defined front lines, nor fortified positions with sandbags and MG-42 machine guns. Combat now takes place within a few steps, sometimes centimeters, the enemy's hot breath mingling with one's own icy sweat. It is too close for elaborate strategy, too close for any illusion of control, too close for humanity. It's man against man, in a deadly embrace that knows no mercy. A German soldier, still dazed from the impact of a grenade that exploded meters away, raises his rifle with trembling hands, trying to focus his teary eyes. Before he can make out anything in the dim light, a shadow appears before him like a materialized demon. He barely has time to react. The impact comes swiftly, savagely. A Soviet rifle butt strikes his face with brutal force, crushing his cheekbone, filling his mouth with warm blood and broken teeth. He falls backward, disoriented, the world spinning in a vortex of pain and nausea, tasting the metallic flavor of his own ruin as panic rises in his throat like bile. Beside him, another confrontation erupts almost simultaneously, as if the entire trench pulsed with the same frenzied heart. A Soviet advances with his bayonet already fixed to the end of his Mosin Nagant, the blade gleaming briefly in the light of a distant shot. The German tries to block with his rifle. The two clash with a crash of wood and metal, fighting with desperate fury, pushing each other against the narrow, damp walls of the trench. The space is so tight, there is no retreat. Bodies press against each other, elbows bump against ribs, knees seek groins. They fight like animals trapped in an earthen cage, grunting, growling, biting the air. The mud on the ground, now a slippery sludge mixed with fresh blood and exposed entrails, makes every step a betrayal. Soldiers slip, fall to their knees, try to get up with their nails digging into the earth, and often don't make it in time, feeling the weight of a boot crushing their neck or a blade tearing their throat. Screams echo from all sides, a chorus of agony rising to the black, indifferent sky. Some are of excruciating pain, others of superhuman effort, and many are abruptly cut short. A damp gurgle, a final sigh, the sound of something breaking irreversibly. A German tries to reload his weapon with fingers numb from the Siberian cold and the terror that freezes the blood in his veins. His hands tremble. The magazine slips, the mechanism jams in the mud. The cold, the fear, and the chaos exact their inexorable price. Before he can complete the movement, an enemy is already upon him, a crushing weight, an arm around his neck, the hot breath of vodka and hatred in his ear. There is no room for error. There is no time to think. Every second is a verdict of life or death. Firearms are still used, but irregularly, almost suicidally. Close-range shots illuminate the scene with quick, merciless flashes, revealing fragmented images that are etched into the retina like eternal nightmares. Tense, sweaty faces, eyes wide with primal terror, mouths agape in silent screams, violent movements of intertwined arms and legs. And then the darkness returns, denser, more devouring, as if the night itself conspired with the invaders to swallow the defenders. In many places, weapons cease to be useful, too close, too slow for the frenzy. Then the most primitive tools of war come into play, those that reveal man in his most animalistic essence. Trench knives sharpened in desperation, long, thirsty Soviet bayonets, clenched fists that break bones, buttstocks transformed into improvised maces. A German soldier manages to knock down his opponent with a powerful blow to the skull, feeling the impact reverberate in his arms. But before he can catch his breath, a sigh of relief that lasts less than a heartbeat. Another enemy emerges from behind, silent as death. He spins in panic, tries to react purely by reflex, blocks an attack that almost tears out his eye. The two stare at each other for a fleeting instant, a second charged with electric tension, where both know in their bones that only one will leave alive. The Soviets' eyes gleam with the determination of one fighting for the invaded motherland. The Germans, with the despair of one watching the dream of the millennium crumble in the mud. And then the fight begins again, faster, more desperate, more brutal. Elbows, knees, bites, nails digging into flesh. There is no honor in that moment. There is no military formation. There is no elegant strategy from Clausewitz's manuals. Only raw survival, the instinct to kill or be killed. Gradually, the psychological impact devastates like an invisible plague. Some German soldiers panic completely, shattering like glass under a hammer. The lack of visibility, the constant noise of gunfire and screams, the impossibility of clearly identifying the enemy, all this erodes Prussian confidence to its core. They begin to retreat aimlessly, bumping into comrades, creating even more confusion, shooting at shadows that might be friends. Others fight with an almost irrational intensity, driven by paralyzing fear, by adrenaline burning like fire in their veins, by the animal need to stay alive for a few more miserable seconds. Despair spreads like a disease. Where are the reinforcements? Where is the Führer now while we bleed here? Thoughts that dare not be spoken aloud, but which echo in the mind like funeral bells. The Soviets, on the other hand, maintain a lethal focus, even in the vortex. They are not there to linger, to conquer ground in the name of glory. They are there to inflict swift, precise, devastating damage, a lesson learned in the furnaces of Stalingrad and the steppes of Kursk. Every movement has a deadly purpose. A blow to the jugular, a shove that throws the enemy against a sharp stake, an advance that clears the way for the next. They strike, destroy, disappear into the curves of the trench, reappear elsewhere like specters, as if the trench itself, with its walls of cold earth and rotten wood, were alive and conspiring against the Germans, favoring the sons of Russia. The fighting spreads like wildfire, from one sector to another, from one narrow corridor to the next, consuming everything in invisible flames of violence. Within that labyrinth of earth, cracked wood and accumulated death, bodies of beheaded sentries, rats fleeing between legs, the stench of decomposition mixed with the fresh smell of slaughter, the war loses any semblance of civilized order. It transforms into something raw, primal, violent to the core. Too human, because it reveals what man is capable of when civilization collapses, and absolutely ruthless, like the very history of the Eastern Front. Years of invasion, hunger, cold, and accumulated hatred that now unleash themselves in every blow, in every stifled cry, in every life reaped in the darkness. Finally, when the grey dawn finally creeps on the horizon, what remains is a silence broken only by the groans of the dying. A silence that brings not peace, but the crushing weight of despair, the conquered trench, the dead comrades, the broken line, and the terrible certainty that the following night will bring more of the same, more chaos, more terror, more of the feeling that Eastern Russia is an endless maw that swallows entire armies and spits out only bones. The fear does not end. It settles in the surviving souls like a wound that never heals. A terror that whispers that, in the end, no one escapes the darkness. The fighting doesn't cease. It merely changes form, like a wounded beast that, instead of dying, writhes in increasingly savage and unpredictable spasms. What was once a desperate struggle against a visible enemy now transforms into something infinitely more dangerous, more insidious, more devastating. The complete, utter loss of control over one's own trench, over one's own men, over one's own sanity. There is no longer a clear line between attack and defense, between front and rear. There is no longer coordination, no hierarchy, nor that Prussian discipline that once transformed soldiers into war machines. What was once an organized military position, with well-defined sectors, command posts, supply lines, machine guns lined up like steel sentinels, now dissolves into a chaotic labyrinth of churned-up earth, shattered wood, and bodies piled up like torn sacks of flour. Each man fights on his own, reduced to an isolated animal trying only to survive the next few seconds, the next heartbeats that echo like drums of condemnation in his chest. Communication simply vanishes, swallowed by the voracious maw of chaos. The officers, those men with gleaming helmets and commanding voices who once inspired blind obedience, try to shout orders with their throats ablaze. Halten, Stellung halten, Feuer nach links. But their voices are lost, suffocated by the incessant roar of distant explosions, the dry crackle of gunfire, the shrill cries that rise and fall like waves of a sea of agony. Even when a soldier miraculously manages to catch a word, there is no time to interpret it, to obey, to think. Every decision is born from the most primitive instinct, the same instinct that, in that moment of absolute darkness, begins to fail tragically, like a clock that loses its hands and marks invented hours. Darkness remains the greatest enemy, greater than any Soviet with a bayonet in hand. The Russian night, dense, sticky, almost palpable, envelops everything like a cloak of black velvet soaked in blood. The few flashes of light, rifle shots exploding in orange sparks, grenades illuminating the sky with an infernal glow for fractions of a second, reveal quick, disconnected scenes, fragments of a nightmare that dissolves before it can be understood. A face contorted in terror, a weapon raised in despair, a sudden movement of a body that could be friend or demon. And then everything returns to absolute black, blacker than before, as if the darkness were taking revenge for having been briefly violated. There's not enough time to identify uniforms with certainty, to distinguish the Feldgrey of the Reich from the Soviet olive green. Everything blends into the mud, the blood, the cold sweat that runs down faces. And then begins the worst possible scenario, transforming terror into something that corrodes the soul from within. German soldiers begin shooting at each other, a suspicious movement in the dark, a shoulder rising, a shadow shifting to the wrong side, and the trigger is pulled without confirmation by pure animal reflex. The shot echoes, dry and definitive, followed by a dull thud of a body falling into the mud. When the momentary light of another shot reveals the truth, it's too late. The fallen man is a comrade from months in the trenches, a young man from Munich sharing his last cigarette, a father speaking of children he would never see again. The warm blood spreads, mixing with the dirty snow, and the shooter is paralyzed for an instant that seems eternal, the rifle still smoking in trembling hands, his mind screaming silently, "What have I done? My God, what have I done?" Doubt corrodes confidence like acid poured on steel. Now every shadow could be an enemy, or it could be an ally, a brother in arms who seconds before swore to die by your side. No one is certain of anything. Paranoia sets in like a high fever, making hearts beat irregularly, eyes water with exhaustion and terror. A group of soldiers, perhaps 5 or 6, tries to retreat to reorganize the defense in a more safe sector, if there is any safety left anywhere. On the way, they collide with other men coming from the opposite direction, equally lost, equally blind. Bodies bump into each other in the narrowness of the trench. Elbows hit ribs, boots slip in the viscous mud. They exchange conflicting information, voices hoarse with panic. The Ivans are on the left, for God's sake, on the left, while others swear with wide eyes. No, on the right! I saw the silhouettes, they're coming from the right! Nothing makes sense. Voices overlap. Orders contradict each other, and the group dissolves into even smaller fragments, each following its own illusion of salvation. The perception of battle, fragments like a broken mirror, each shard reflecting a different and terrifying reality. Each small group believes itself surrounded, isolated, abandoned by the command that in Berlin may not even know that the line is crumbling. Each man feels alone in the world, that the entire Reich has collapsed and only he remains, a tiny point of flesh and fear in the middle of an ocean of night. A soldier, a corporal from Dresden, his hands still stained with the blood of his recently deceased. A friend runs through a section of the trench, his heart pounding as if it wants to escape his chest. He tries to find his officer, someone who can bring order to the chaos. He turns an abrupt corner, slips on the mud mixed with exposed entrails, and falls hard, his face hitting the cold earth. When he raises his head, gasping, he sees a figure ahead, a silhouette outlined against the darkness. Without thinking, instinct takes over. His finger pulls the trigger. His body falls with a muffled groan. Only later, when he crawls to the fallen man and turns his face with trembling hands, does he realize it was one of his own. A familiar face, eyes wide with eternal surprise. He freezes for a second that stretches like centuries. His mind tries to process the guilt, the horror, the futility of it all, but there is no time for guilt. Another sound emerges behind him, a step in the mud, the click of a gun being cocked, and he needs to react again, turning his body, firing into the dark, praying that this time it will be the enemy. The confusion intensifies with each passing minute, like an avalanche gaining speed and sweeping everything away. Weapons are abandoned on the ground, Mauser rifles covered in mud and blood, grenades forgotten in the pockets of the dead. Equipment is scattered, rolled over helmets, torn backpacks, letters from home trampled on the earth. Men shout names that receive no answer. Hans! Kurt! Where the hell are you? And the echo returns empty, as if the trench devoured the words. Others simply stop, leaning against the damp earthen walls, their eyes glazed, their chests rising and falling in short, shallow breaths. They try to understand what is happening, completely overwhelmed, their minds broken by the weight of a terror that has no name. The terror of no longer knowing who the enemy is, of no longer knowing if they are still soldiers or just prey. And while all this is happening, while the German war machine is self-destructing in its own confusion, the Soviets keep moving. They don't need to dominate the entire trench. They don't need red flags waving over the parapets. They only need to maintain the chaos, to feed it like gasoline on a fire. They attack specific points, a machine gun nest here, a radio station there, appearing where they are not expected, like ghosts emerging from the earthen walls, disappearing before there is any organized reaction. Each of their actions is a spark thrown onto the powder keg of German doubt. It's as if they are inside the minds of the defenders, whispering lies, turning the Reich's strength against itself. A Soviet shot echoes, and 10 Germans respond by firing at each other. A grenade rolls, and panic spreads like a plague. The trench ceases to be a defensive position, a bulwark of the Führer. It becomes a psychological trap, a pit of despair dug by the defender's own hands, a place where the enemy could be anywhere or nowhere, where fear dictates decisions, where error is inevitable, where paranoia reigns supreme. Little by little, order disappears completely. What little discipline remained dissolves into incoherent screams, aimless runs, men kneeling in the mud and murmuring forgotten childhood prayers. Despair is palpable, a cold weight crushing the chest. The feeling that Eastern Russia is not just a battlefront, but a living abyss, swallowing entire armies, transforming heroes into anonymous corpses, making the dream of the millennium crumble into a pit of mud and friendly blood. And in the midst of this total chaos, while dawn is still slow in coming, a terrible truth settles in the heart of each survivor. They are no longer fighting against the Soviets. They are fighting against themselves. And they are losing. In the midst of that chaos, something even more dangerous than blades, grenades, and gunfire begins to dominate the battlefield. Fear. Not the common fear of being under attack, but a deeper fear, harder to control. A fear that paralyzes, confuses, and makes the soldier himself doubt everything around him. The Soviets understand this, and they use them as weapons. They are not there merely to physically eliminate the enemy. They want to break something more important, the mind. They know that a man overcome by panic becomes unpredictable, makes mistakes, reacts before thinking, and often destroys his own defenses without outside help. Therefore, every movement during the attack is calculated to cause a psychological impact. The screams are not random. They are used at the right time. In the darkness, voices emerge from different directions, some too close, others too far away. Sometimes they are short commands in Russian, sometimes they are abrupt shouts that echo through the trenches. To the Germans, it sounds as if the enemy is everywhere at once. And in a way, that's exactly the intention. The attacks happen at alternating points. One sector is hit violently, while another remains silent for a few seconds. When the Germans try to reorganize, the attack comes from somewhere else. There is never a clear pattern. There is never a predictable rhythm. This prevents any attempt at adaptation. Some soldiers start firing indiscriminately just to try and scare away what they believe is around them. Others remain motionless, afraid to reveal their position. There are those who constantly circle, trying to cover all directions at once, but end up protecting none. The mind begins to fail. Logic disappears. The environment contributes to this. The darkness remains absolute. The sounds continue to be distorted by the wind and the trench structures. Each echo seems closer than it actually is. Each silence seems laden with threat. And then the most disturbing moments arrive. A soldier swears he saw someone in front of him. He fires and finds nothing when the light from the shot fades. Another hears footsteps behind him, turns around quickly, but there's no one there. Or perhaps there is, and he simply can't see it. Doubt sets in irreversibly. Now, it's not just the enemy that causes fear anymore. It's the environment itself. It is the mind itself. The Soviets took advantage of this with precision. They attack quickly, disappear, leaving behind just enough to keep the terror alive. They don't need to stay. They don't need to completely dominate the terrain. Each incursion is like a psychological blow that continues to echo even after they are no longer present. And the Germans feel it. Even when there is no direct contact, the fear remains. Breathe along with them. It moves along with them. A soldier leans against the trench wall, trying to catch his breath. His eyes are wide open, too alert. He tries to listen, but now everything sounds suspicious. Even the sound of his own breathing seems too loud. He knows he needs to stay in control, but control is already slipping away, because that night, the enemy is not only attacking the body, it's attacking the mind. And when the mind begins to give way, the battle is already, for the most part, lost. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, the attack starts to fade. There is no clear sign of retreat for the Germans. There is no moment when someone shouts, "It's over." What happens is stranger, more disconcerting. The chaos simply diminishes. The screams become less frequent, the shots become spaced out. The shadows that had been appearing from all sides began to disappear one by one. But this does not bring immediate relief. It brings confusion, because nobody knows for sure if it's really over or if it's just a pause before something even worse. While the Germans are still trying to understand what is happening, Soviet soldiers are already executing the final phase of the operation, the withdrawal, and it's as precise as infiltration. No rush, don't panic, they don't run away, they retreat, with discipline, under control. Small groups begin to move away along the same paths they came in by, holes in the barbed wire, stretches of familiar terrain, spots where silence can still be maintained. Some carry with them what they came looking for, prisoners, men caught in the chaos, often still disoriented and unable to react, are pulled from the trench before they even understand what has happened. Others take documents, maps, any useful information found during the attack. And then there are those who simply leave everything behind, except the impact, because that has always been the main objective: to cause harm, destabilize, disappear, before the enemy can reorganize. Inside the trenches, some Germans still fire into the darkness, believing the attack continues. Others advance cautiously, trying to pursue shadows that are no longer there. But this reaction is already too late. The enemy is no longer there. Only the echoes of the attack remain. A German soldier reaches the edge of the trench, panting, and looks out at the field ahead. He sees no movement, no advance, only still. Darkness, as if nothing had happened. But it happened, and he knows it. Everyone knows. The Soviet withdrawal does not leave a common void. She leaves behind a different kind of silence, a heavy silence, loaded, because now, more than ever, Germans understand something with frightening clarity. The enemy can enter whenever he wants, attack however you want, and to leave without being stopped. This realization is devastating, not just physically, but mentally. Confidence in the defenses is beginning to crumble. The idea of safety within the trench disappears, and what remains is a constant feeling of vulnerability. Meanwhile, already far away, the Soviets continue moving through the darkness, returning to their lines with the same silent discipline with which they advanced. For them, the mission was accomplished. For the Germans, the night is not over yet, because even without the presence of the enemy, the fear remains. The night, which seemed endless, finally begins to give way. First, in an almost imperceptible way. The sky ceases to be a completely black block and takes on a grayish, cold, lifeless hue. The light emerges slowly, weakly, as if the day itself hesitated to reveal what had happened there. Inside the German trenches, the men are still tense. Nobody relaxes immediately. Some remain with their weapons pointed, eyes fixed on the darkness that is now slowly dissolving. Others simply breathe deeply, trying to understand if the attack has truly ended. Silence returns, but it's not the same silence as before. This one is different, heavier, more definitive. And then, as the light increases, the reality is starting to emerge. First, indistinct forms, details later, and then complete horror. Bodies scattered along the trench in the positions where they fell during the fighting. Some still hold their weapons. Others appear to have tried to get up, without success. The mud, once dark and uniform, now reveals denser, deeper stains. Blood has mingled with the ground, creating a heavy, unbearable scene. Equipment is everywhere. Helmets fallen, abandoned rifles, fragments of wood destroyed by the explosions. Parts of the trench collapsed, creating uneven holes and making the path even more difficult to traverse. A German soldier walks slowly, looking around. His steps are cautious, almost automatic. He observes a body in front of him and recognizes the face, a companion, perhaps someone you spoke to a few hours earlier. He pauses for a second, But there is no time for emotional reaction. Not there, not at that moment. Other soldiers do the same. They walk through the trench as if they were in an unfamiliar place. Even though it's the same space where they spent days, weeks. Everything seems different now. Narrower, heavier, more empty. The wounded are starting to be found. Some were still conscious, calling for help in a low voice, almost without strength. Others were just breathing with difficulty, their eyes vacant, trapped between pain and shock. The screams of the night were replaced by moans, low constants, hard to ignore. Improvised teams attempt to organize the rescue. Men carry others, use pieces of wood as stretchers, and do what they can with what they have. But not everyone can be helped, and that becomes clear quickly. In certain parts of the trench, the silence is absolute. No movement, no voice. It's just confirmation that there's nothing more to be done there. The psychological impact begins to take hold more deeply. During the night, fear prevailed. Now with the light of day comes understanding. The soldiers begin to put the pieces together. They realize how the enemy got in. They realize where they went wrong. They realize how vulnerable they really were. And perhaps the hardest thing to accept, they realize how quickly everything happened. A short attack, necessary. It's devastating. One of the officers tries to reorganize the men, give orders, re-establish some kind of structure, but his voice carries a different weight now. It's no longer just authority. It's tense. It's a concern, because he saw it too. He understood as well. The dawn, which should bring relief, it brings clarity, and with it, a truth impossible to ignore. The trench held, but the feeling of security, this one was completely destroyed. With daylight now established and the rescue activities slowing down, something less visible, but far more profound, begins to take hold among the German soldiers. It's not immediate like a grenade exploding. It's not as noisy as combat. It's quiet, progressive. It's devastating. The body still responds, still moves, still executes commands. But the mind is no longer the same. The men who survived that night now carry something that cannot be left behind in the trench, a living memory, a constant weight. Some continue their tasks as normal, cleaning weapons, rearranging positions, helping the wounded. At first glance they seem untouched, but a closer look reveals the changes. The eyes, always alert, always searching for something, even when there is nothing. One soldier turns quickly upon hearing a distant sound, just the wind. Another grips his rifle with excessive force, as if expecting an attack at any second, even in broad daylight. Rest disappears, because the night will return, and everyone knows that. Some try to sleep during the day, taking advantage of the few hours of relative safety. But sleep doesn't come easily. When it does, it's light, interrupted by any noise. Many wake up suddenly, breathless, as if they were still in the middle of the attack. Others simply don't sleep. They prefer to stay awake, even when exhausted, rather than close their eyes and become vulnerable. Fatigue begins to accumulate, and with it, instability. Confidence in the defenses has been broken. Previously, the trench was seen as protection, a clear boundary between being safe and being in danger. Now, that line no longer exists. The enemy has proven that it can cross any barrier at any time without warning. This realization changes everything. Every shadow during dusk begins to look suspicious. Every sound during the night takes on meaning, and the silence becomes unbearable. A group of soldiers converse in hushed voices, not about strategy, not about orders, but about the previous night. Each one recounts what he saw, or what he believes he saw, and the stories don't match. Some swear there were dozens of enemies. Others say they were few in number, but they seem to be everywhere. Some say you heard footsteps behind you the whole time, and there are those who claim they heard absolutely nothing until the moment of the attack. These differences do not bring clarity. They bring more doubt, and doubt fuels fear. One of the soldiers remains silent apart from the others. He clutches his helmet in his hands, staring at the ground. His breathing is slow and heavy. He survived. but his mind is still trapped in the darkness of the previous night. He knows he'll have to face that again, and that's what affects him the most. It wasn't just an isolated experience. It's a constant threat, something that could happen again, every night. The officers notice the change. They try to maintain discipline, reinforce orders, organize shifts, and increase vigilance. But even they feel the weight of the situation. They know they're not just dealing with physical exhaustion. They are dealing with something that is more difficult to control, psychological strain. And in war, a tired army can continue fighting, a wounded army can continue advancing, but an army dominated by fear, it begins to fall apart from the inside, without needing a direct attack, without needing a clear defeat. Gradually, the men in the German trenches begin to understand that surviving that night was not the end of anything. It was only the beginning, because now, even in broad daylight, the war continues within them. And when the sun begins to set again, fear will return along with the darkness. After that night, one thing became clear to the German command. It could not be repeated in the same way, or at least it can't happen without resistance. Still, during the day, officers patrol the trenches, assessing the damage, observing the points where the Soviets managed to infiltrate. They analyze every detail, the cut wire, the less guarded sections, the areas where the terrain offered more cover. Now, the goal is simple. Close all the gaps. Orders are being given quickly. More sentries are being positioned, not just at the obvious entrances, but at strategic points along the entire line. Shifts are reinforced. No one should be left alone for too long. There are always 2 or more men on guard together. The idea is to reduce the risk of silent elimination. But this brings another problem. More men exposed, more targets. In addition, makeshift lighting is starting to be installed. Signal lights are distributed in greater quantities. Some sectors receive portable spotlights powered by fragile generators, which project unstable beams of light onto the ground ahead of the trench. For a few moments, this seems to work. The light pierces the darkness, revealing craters, barbed wire, and patches of uneven terrain, but it also casts even deeper shadows, and in those shadows, anything can hide. Mines are placed in areas considered vulnerable. Wires are reinforced, now with additional layers, denser, more difficult to cut. Some improvised traps are set up. Cans, wires, small objects that can produce sound if touched. Any noise is now treated as a major alert. The soldiers receive stricter instructions. No relaxing allowed. Don't let your guard down. Any suspicious movement should be responded to immediately. But these measures, while necessary, do not solve the main problem. The enemy does not attack in the same way twice. The following night, when darkness returns, the tension is even greater. The Germans are better prepared, pay closer attention, but also more nervous. Every little sound triggers a reaction. A piece of metal sways in the wind, a soldier launches a flare, a shadow moves, shots are fired. The result is an even more chaotic environment. Now it's not just the enemy who can initiate combat, fear itself can. The Soviets notice these changes, and they adapt. They avoid well-lit areas, explore new routes, and use the Germans' exaggerated reaction to their advantage. They know that the more tense the enemy is, the more mistakes they will make, and the mistakes keep happening. In some cases, the warning devices themselves create confusion. A noise caused by the wind triggers a chain reaction. Soldiers believe they are under attack and begin firing, throwing grenades, generating panic even though there isn't a single Soviet present at that point. Wear and tear increases. The nights are getting longer, heavier, more unpredictable, and even with all the new measures, the feeling of security doesn't return, because deep down everyone knows it doesn't matter how many lights are turned on, it doesn't matter how many men are on guard, it doesn't matter how many defenses are reinforced. The enemy may still find a way in, it can still adapt, it can still attack, and when that happens, All that preparation may not be enough. The trenches are still standing. The weapons remain loaded. But the certainty of control, that one doesn't exist anymore. As the days and nights pass, something becomes evident to all who live through that brutal reality on the Eastern Front. This is not just a war over territory. It's not just a dispute over positions, maps, or lines on the ground. It's a war of mental resistance. The trenches are still there. The weapons continue to be used. The attacks continue to happen. But what truly marks those men is not just the fighting itself. It's what's left afterwards. The memory, constant tension, the certainty that chaos could return at any moment. The Soviet night raids leave an impact that goes far beyond physical casualties. They completely alter how German soldiers view warfare. During the day, there is still some logic to it. Movements can be observed. Orders can be followed. There is a minimal sense of control. But when night falls, all of that disappears. Darkness is not simply the absence of light. It transforms into a territory dominated by fear, a space where vision fails, where sounds deceive, where the mind creates threats, and where real threats arise without warning. Over time, soldiers cease to fear only the enemy. They begin to fear the night itself. The sunset becomes a somber event, something everyone observes in silence, as if every minute of light were too precious to be wasted. Some men start counting the hours, others avoid looking at the horizon, as if ignoring nightfall might delay it. But he always shows up, and when it arrives, the fear returns with it. The officers realize they are not dealing with isolated battles, but with a pattern, a form of combat that slowly wears down the enemy night after night until their ability to react is compromised. And it works, because war is not won with weapons alone. It is also defeated when one side begins to lose confidence in itself, when you start to doubt your own ability to resist, when fear starts making decisions. The Soviet attacks demonstrate exactly that. They don't need to completely destroy a position. They don't need to occupy every square meter of land. Just go in, cause damage, spread terror, and leave. The rest is done by the enemy's mind. And this type of impact doesn't disappear with the sunrise. It accumulates, day after day, night after night, until the war ceases to be merely physical, and it becomes psychological. For many German soldiers, surviving these attacks did not mean victory. It means carrying something that cannot be dropped, a constant reminder of vulnerability, a constant feeling of being on edge, a war that continues even when there are no shots fired. And that's what defines that brutal scenario on the Eastern Front. It wasn't just a fight for survival on the battlefield. It was a struggle to keep one's own mind intact. Because in the end, in the darkness of those nights, fear was the most silent weapon, and also the most powerful of all.